Okay, it's appropriate that this event be held here in New York for a couple of reasons beyond many of the other ones that you may have heard, and that's, in my opinion, because it's the financial capital of the world and it holds a special place in the history of energy. It was here to quote an old book passage that Thomas Edison realized the consummation of his broad and original scheme. The Pearl Street station was officially started by admitting steam to the engine of one of the jumbos, and current was generated. Why is the central role this city has in economic growth and its historical tie to energy make it an appropriate venue for a conference on climate change? That's probably not as lost on you as it might be for some. For some, the climate issue is just about a concern that there's too much CO2 and that we need to somehow make less of it. And people are rushing to do just that: cap and trade, taxes, and something that I'll end with, renewable portfolio standards. Generally anything to reduce CO2. Well, how exactly that should be achieved is a little bit more hazy. Just how difficult it would be to get CO2 concentrations where some believe they need to be is revealed by the particulars of some of the proposals to do so using current technology. One notion that has been put forward is that various carbon emissions offset strategies, called wedges, that use existing technologies can be adopted over the next 50 years to reduce CO2 concentrations. The idea is that each wedge would represent a means to offset a 1 gigaton section of a triangle formed by the upward sloping line, the red line there you see, of carbon emissions anticipated with energy, economic, and population growth, and a baseline representing the atmospheric CO2 level, that blue dotted line. And there you see the blue triangle. And here you see individual wedges that meet that whole delta, the area that some believe need to be reduced. Well, each one of those wedges, each one of those little slivers is theoretically equivalent to a gigaton of carbon. How do you get there? The authors put forth a number of ideas. One wedge would require about 50 times today's wind energy, an area about 74 million acres, somewhat less than the state of Arizona. You could get another wedge of offsets from solar panel generated electricity, about 700 times the amount generated today, requiring around 5 million acres. That's about the size of Israel. We could get another wedge of nuclear power by approximately doubling the installed nuclear capacity and nuclear power output. We could get another wedge by doubling the efficiency of conversion of fuel to electricity at a huge number of coal-fired power plants, as if people kind of burn more coal than they need to. Another wedge from reforesting approximately 250 million tropical acres. That's more than France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and several more European nations combined, and reforesting 400 million temperate acres. That's an area larger than India and Pakistan put together. And another wedge would be created with 300 million acres of plantations on currently barren lands, an area approaching, I think it's about 8% shy of Argentina, and reducing clear cutting of primary tropical forests to 0. That gets us to 6. We could get a 7th, for example, and this was included by the authors before the new data started rolling in on ethanol, but by replacing 2 billion conventionally fueled cars with ethanol cars, requiring some 617 million acres, about 1/6 of the world's cropland. Well, the wedge authors explain that the number of wedges needed is dependent upon the growth rate of carbon emissions, and that they started with 1.5% annual growth rate based on the past 30 years. But if carbon emissions grew at 2%, you'd need 7, not 10 wedges. And if they grew at 3%, you'd need 18 wedges. And I saw a recent analysis done by the Battelle Memorial Institute that was working with a reference case of 26 wedges. So you'd get something quite a bit bigger, and I'm not sure how we would do that. It's really an interesting academic exercise, but implementing 6 or 7 wedges, never mind 10 or 20, is either totally unrealistic or the most horrendous and wrenching social transformation ever imposed on mankind. Such unrealistic strategies are consistent with the thinking that people in an increasingly prosperous and technologically advanced society predominantly pose an environmental threat that begs for planning rather than markets. Along these lines, the IPCC emissions scenario, the storyline, that happens to result in the least predicted increase in temperature and sea level ranges, has an emphasis, and I quote, on global solutions to economic, social, and environmental sustainability, including improved equity, but without additional climate initiatives. Some of the tools mentioned to achieve this include, quote, in implementing non-climate taxes / subsidies or other fiscal or regulatory policies that promote sustainable development, which you heard Paul talk about, and some of our remarks will mirror each other here. But the point is that aside from the scientific issues, much of the political debate around climate is really about how much economic growth is healthy or even morally right. The reality is that sustainable is unfortunately often used as a code word for reduced economic growth, because reduced economic growth is not, for good reason, an easy sell. It can, however, be promoted indirectly by constricting energy supply. At the recent Davos Economic Conference, the 2008 Environmental Performance Index, a joint effort involving the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy and the Earth Institute at Columbia University, got a bit of attention. According to this report, Bangladesh, Bolivia, Ethiopia, Haiti, and the Sudan score better than the United States with regard to ecosystem vitality. Let that sink in for a second. Now, while the US scored better than these nations with regard to environmental health, the manner in which these measures are constructed leads one to infer that somehow what is needed to improve the most important environmental measurements, human well-being, can be delivered without financial resources, without technology or development, and without energy. Here in the left-hand column, you see how we got edged out by the Sudan, 63.5 to 64.1. It was a close call, I guess. But the authors go on to point out one of the reasons that we get this low ecosystem vitality score is because of the carbon intensity of the United States, and state that countries in the developing world generally have the lowest per capita emissions due to small industrial sectors and lifestyles that have relatively low energy intensities. I guess you could call abject misery and policy and early death a lifestyle. But there you see it kind of reflected in the carbon intensity. And then, of course, if you have a low carbon intensity, a small economy, you consume fewer BTUs per individual. And there's a direct and very positive correlation with regard to one of the most important measurements that ties to human well-being, poverty or prosperity. And here you see the difference in per capita GDP. Well, what happens when you're poor? And I'd like you to take note of those two pictures real quick. The one on the left, I believe, is what would qualify as improved sanitation in my upcoming remarks, and the one on the right would be improved water. Well, poverty has real consequences. Here you see the percent of clean water, which is improved water, according to WHO, which constitutes having access to 20 liters from an improved source within a kilometer of your home. It's not clean water coming into your kitchen. It's within a kilometer of your home. Here you have improved water sanitation among those nations and the United States. And by this definition under WHO, improved sanitation includes ventilated, pour flush, and simple pit latrines, but not bucket latrines, you'll be glad to know. And then one other metric that I thought was pretty important when we're talking about economies and their effect on the environment is shipments of food. Those obviously are coming from the nation with the very low economic vitality score and being sent to those with the very high economic vitality score. And there are some real consequences to these things. You have tragic infant mortality rates in those nations. You have, as Paul mentioned, deaths from indoor combustion of wood fuel. In those nations alone, 111,000 deaths per year, 180,000 deaths per year in those nations related to poor water supplies. And of course, there's malnutrition and starvation. Well, despite these concrete and tragic numbers, to some, what we are doing in growing economies is what's bad. For example, according to one group, the largest ecological footprint belongs to the citizens of the US, 9.57 hectares. People in Bangladesh, on the other hand, need just 0.5 hectares. In other states, if everyone lived like an average person in Bangladesh, where the footprint is only 0.5 hectares, the Earth could support roughly 22 billion people. Really? This assumes that somehow Bengalis' relatively low energy intensity lifestyles are doing the trick. They're not. In the US, for example, we produce 7.44 metric tons of rice per acre compared with 3.89 metric tons of rice per acre in Bangladesh. Perhaps as part of the reason USAID reported sending over 95,000 metric tons there in 2006. And just to put that figure in some kind of visual context, and this is back of the envelope calculations, I think that would require something like 3,900 60-foot semi-trailers, each with over 50,000 tons, bumper to bumper, which would stretch tens of miles long. So, is this energy-deprived and financially impoverished lifestyle really better for the environment? That's, in my opinion, a rhetorical question. But for those who haven't been to an impoverished nation, take a look at the ecosystem vitality. This is an image of pollution that got quite a bit of attention when it was billed as the Asian brown cloud a few years ago. According to NASA, this air pollution, and of course you can see Bangladesh there in the center, this air pollution is a severe and persistent problem at the foothills of the Himalaya Mountains in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, and comes from, quote, inefficient wood and dung-fueled heating and cooking devices, as well as forest fires and industrial and urban pollution. Well, it's assessments like that of Yale and Harvard in their environmental performance review that breed statements like that of former President Bill Clinton, his recent and increasingly infamous remark that we just have to slow down our economy and cut back our greenhouse gas emissions because we have to save the planet for our grandchildren. This thinking is a primary motivation for the push to adopt CO2 caps, carbon taxes, and something that I'm going to end with, renewable portfolio standards. It would be more instructive if they were called RPMs rather than RPSs, renewable portfolio mandates, because that's really what they are. They're mandates. These mandates can be, for example, for capacity to produce energy or a percent of energy generated. And now most states have adopted these standards, and there's only a few, I think 3, where they're voluntary. And you can see the number of states with RPSs. Now, anybody who's a proponent of markets over mandates should ask themselves, if these energy sources, solar, wind, or geothermal, make sense, wouldn't they be adopted without a mandate? And generally, the answer is that unless they were somehow prohibited, a competitive market would make that occur. That's not to say that there are not situations when energy sources that may fall within RPSs don't make sense, but that when they do, they either have been or will be adopted. So why are so many states adopting RPSs? One of the reasons is that politicians are well aware that Americans want something done about energy and are favorable to quite an amorphous concept of energy alternatives, and that includes renewables. To the majority of Americans, what constitutes an alternative is not defined so much as by what it is, as by what it is not. It is not imported energy, particularly oil, from unstable or hostile nations. It's not all oil, but oil from unstable or hostile nations. But those pushing these energy resources, the renewable portfolio standards, as a panacea, have the machinery in place to push for adoptions of RPSs, whether or not they would perform well and whether or not they would be freely chosen. The practical rub is that these sources would not be freely chosen in many of the situations where they're being mandated because they wouldn't perform sufficiently. To get them to see these sources as alternatives to the energy supplies they're concerned about, Americans are being told dishonestly that the potential for many renewable resources is much greater than it truly is. So what's in these standards? Because of the practical problems, often there's a bit of wiggle room, fine print, more than meets the eye. When we see that, for example, such and such a state requires 20% RPS. For example, New York has a RPS of 25%. But guess what? They get about a 19% credit for already existing hydropower. Nothing wrong with hydropower, but there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors going on there. Texas, for example, has renewable portfolio credits, and those are tied to capacity, the theoretical production of installed windmills rather than what's actually generated. If we look at Rhode Island's renewable portfolio standards, the thresholds are close to, if not below, at least according to the energy information data, the amount of renewable energy Rhode Island already produces. When the standards approach existing capacities in out years, there are regulatory or legal mechanisms to go and revisit the standards. Well, why are these hedges being built in? The reason is because market forces already assessed the limited potentials of these resources. Solar, for example, in general, not always, but in general, is just not competitive. According to Severin Bornstein, the director of the University of California Energy Institute, that's a Berkeley professor I'm quoting here, states that the difference, and by the difference he means in the cost of electricity generated from solar and electricity generated from other sources, is so large that including current plausible estimates of the value of reducing greenhouse gases, it still does not come close to making the net social return on installing solar PV today positive. Now, similarly, although wind has shown more potential than solar, it still faces inherent limitations as demonstrated just 1 week ago when a drop in wind generation coupled with colder weather triggered an electric emergency that caused Texas grid operators to cut service to a large number of customers. So, in ending, what do I want you to take away about these RPSs? What are my 2 cents? Well, it's that the RPS advocates are accepting policies, perhaps imperfect in their eyes, as noses under the tent that may be ratcheted upward later. Then there's a likely practical consequence, and that's that states who have wounded themselves in terms of economic competitiveness will end up seeking a level playing field. That is, they'll become advocates for a national standard to make everybody equally worse off so that they can compete, drag down, not lift up. And this push, like the cap and trade or carbon taxes, is carried out under the guise of heading off threatening levels of CO2 and under the guise of solving energy supply challenges. It will achieve neither. It will promote the goal, really a belief, of a sustainable lifestyle, which is to say, reduce economic growth by constricting energy supply. Those goals, reduced energy supply and reduced economic growth, are not supported by the average American. And they are, in reality, bad for the economy, bad for security, and bad for the environment. Thank you.